The silence in courtroom 47 was deafening. 7-year-old Lily Martinez walked through the towering oak doors, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the leather leash of Bruno, a golden retriever whose gentle brown eyes held secrets that nobody in the room could have imagined. Every person in the packed gallery turned to watch the tiny figure make her way toward the witness stand, her steps uncertain but determined. Judge Patricia Hoffman, a woman with 30 years of experience presiding over the most difficult cases in the county, leaned forward in her chair. She studied the child with careful attention. She understood that this moment would determine whether justice would be served or if a dangerous predator would walk free. The weight of the entire case rested on the shoulders of this small girl who had endured unimaginable trauma. Lily was the key witness in a case that had shaken the entire community to its core. A child trafficking ring that had operated in plain sight for over 2 years, preying on vulnerable families with surgical precision. The criminals had targeted single mothers struggling to make ends meet, immigrant families afraid to contact authorities, and children from broken homes who wouldn't be missed immediately. Their operation was sophisticated, using legitimate businesses as fronts and respected community members as shields against suspicion. But there was one critical problem that threatened to derail everything. Lily hadn't uttered a single word since the day she was rescued from a basement prison where she had been held captive for 8 terrifying months. The trauma had stolen her voice, leaving her trapped in a world of silence where nightmares played on endless repeat and trust seemed impossible to rebuild. The prosecution team had worked tirelessly to prepare alternative methods of testimony, but they knew that without Lily's direct identification of her captors, the case could crumble. Across the courtroom at the defense table sat Marcus Webb, a 52-year-old real estate developer whose charming smile and philanthropic reputation had made him one of the most respected members of the community. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculately styled, and his expression remained calm and confident despite the serious charges against him. Webb had built his fortune through legitimate real estate deals, but had used his business connections and community standing to facilitate one of the most sophisticated trafficking operations the FBI had ever encountered. Webb's public persona was that of a devoted family man and generous philanthropist. He had donated millions to children's charities, served on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations, and was frequently photographed at community events shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. His sprawling estate hosted annual fundraisers for various causes, and his name appeared on plaques throughout the city, recognizing his contributions to local development projects. But beneath this carefully crafted facade lurked a monster who had destroyed countless young lives. Webb had been arrested after a police raid on his property uncovered evidence of his involvement in the trafficking operation. But his high-powered legal team had systematically dismantled much of the prosecution's case, challenging the admissibility of evidence, questioning the reliability of witness testimony, and exploiting every legal loophole available. They had successfully argued that much of the physical evidence was circumstantial, and that the testimonies of other rescued children were too traumatized to be considered reliable, leaving everything hanging on the testimony of a traumatized child who couldn't speak. Webb's attorney, Sandra Mitchell, was one of the most feared defense lawyers in the state, known for her ruthless tactics and her ability to create reasonable doubt even in seemingly airtight cases. She had built her entire defense strategy around discrediting Lily's ability to provide reliable testimony, arguing that the child's trauma had made her memories unreliable and that without verbal confirmation, there was no way to verify her account. Mitchell had successfully defended numerous high-profile criminals by exploiting the vulnerabilities of traumatized witnesses, and she was confident that this case would be no different. But what neither the defense nor anyone else in that courtroom knew was that Lily had developed her own way of communicating, one that only she and Bruno understood. During the long months of recovery, Lily had worked with Dr. Sarah Coleman, a renowned child psychologist who specialized in treating victims of severe trauma. Dr. Coleman had recognized that traditional therapy methods might not be effective for a child who had retreated so completely into herself, so she had recommended an unconventional approach involving animal-assisted therapy. Bruno had been carefully selected from a specialized program that trained therapy animals to work with severely traumatized children. He was not just any golden retriever, but a highly intelligent animal who had undergone months of intensive training to recognize subtle signs of distress and respond appropriately. His previous handler had been a military veteran suffering from PTSD, and Bruno had demonstrated a remarkable ability to sense emotional states and provide comfort during panic attacks and flashbacks. The bond between Lily and Bruno had developed slowly over many months of patient work. Initially, Lily had been afraid of the dog, as she was afraid of everything else in her new world. But Bruno's gentle persistence and unwavering patience had gradually broken through her defenses. He would lie quietly beside her during therapy sessions, never demanding attention, but always available when she needed comfort. He seemed to understand that she communicated differently and had learned to interpret her subtle gestures and movements. As Lily settled into the witness chair, her dark eyes swept across the room, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces, the imposing architecture of the courtroom, and the formal atmosphere that felt so different from the safe spaces where she had been learning to heal again. Her breathing became shallow, and her small hands began to tremble as the familiar signs of panic started to build. But then her gaze landed on Marcus Webb sitting confidently at the defense table, and in that instant, something extraordinary happened. Her small hands began to move in a series of subtle gestures that appeared random to everyone watching. But Bruno's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The moment Lily's fingers formed the silent signal, the golden retriever's entire body went rigid. His ears shot forward, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from deep within his chest. His usually gentle demeanor transformed into something fierce and protective as his gaze locked onto Webb with laser-like intensity. The transformation was so sudden and dramatic that several people in the gallery gasped audibly. The reaction sent a wave of confusion through the courtroom. Spectators began to whisper among themselves, wondering what had caused the therapy dog to respond so dramatically. Some assumed that the animal was simply reacting to his handler's distress, but those who knew Bruno understood that his behavior was far more specific than a general protective response. This was recognition. This was a targeted reaction to a perceived threat. Judge Hoffman's eyebrows furrowed as she observed the scene unfolding before her. She had seen countless cases involving children and their support animals, but never had she witnessed such a specific and intense reaction to a particular person in the room. Her years of experience had taught her to pay attention to details that others might miss, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that something significant had just occurred. District Attorney Robert Chin, who had been prosecuting child exploitation cases for over 15 years, felt his pulse quicken as he watched Bruno's behavior. He had worked with therapy dogs before and understood that their reactions were never random or meaningless. This was something significant, something that could change the entire trajectory of a case. But he needed to understand exactly what had just occurred before he could act on it. Chin had built his career on attention to detail and his ability to recognize when seemingly small moments could become turning points in major cases. The prosecution team had spent months preparing for this trial, knowing that they were facing one of the most challenging cases of their careers. The evidence against Webb was substantial, but much of it was circumstantial, and they knew that his defense team would exploit every weakness in their case. They had interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed thousands of pieces of evidence, and consulted with experts in fields ranging from psychology to digital forensics. But they had always known that Lily's testimony would be the key to securing a conviction. Judge Hoffman raised her hand, signaling for quiet in the courtroom. Then she addressed the room with measured authority. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of her years on the bench. Something important had just happened, and she needed time to consult with the experts to understand the full implications of what they had all witnessed. The judge had presided over thousands of cases during her career, but she had learned to trust her instincts when something felt significant. As the courtroom began to empty, Lily remained in her chair, her small frame pressed against Bruno's side, her fingers still gripping his golden fur tightly. The connection between them was palpable, a bond forged through months of shared healing and mutual trust. Her mother, Maria Martinez, hurried forward, kneeling beside her daughter and placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "Sweetheart," she whispered in Spanish, her voice trembling with emotion. "Are you okay, my brave girl?" Maria had been through her own journey of healing since Lily's rescue. The guilt of not being able to protect her daughter had nearly destroyed her, and she had spent months in therapy learning to forgive herself and focus on helping Lily recover. She had quit her job to devote herself full-time to her daughter's care, attending every therapy session, learning about trauma recovery, and advocating tirelessly for other families affected by trafficking. The strength she had found in herself surprised everyone, including Maria herself. Lily didn't respond verbally, but she leaned into her mother's embrace while keeping one hand firmly planted on Bruno's head. The connection between the child and her canine companion was unmistakable. They communicated in ways that transcended words, sharing an understanding that had been forged through months of healing and trust. Bruno had become more than just a therapy animal. He had become Lily's voice, her protector, and her bridge back to a world that had once seemed too dangerous to trust. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the child psychologist who had been working with Lily since her rescue, approached the small group with careful steps. She had been the one to recommend Bruno as a therapy animal, understanding that traditional forms of communication might not be possible for a child who had endured such severe trauma. Dr. Coleman had spent her entire career working with traumatized children, but Lily's case had challenged her in ways she had never experienced before. The depth of Lily's trauma had required innovative approaches to therapy. Dr. Coleman had studied cases from around the world, looking for methods that might help a child who had retreated so completely into herself. She had consulted with colleagues in Europe who had developed new techniques for working with trafficking survivors and had adapted their methods to fit Lily's specific needs. The breakthrough had come when they introduced Bruno and began developing the unique communication system that had become their lifeline. "Dr. Coleman," she said softly, addressing Maria, "can you tell me exactly what happened when Lily made those hand movements?" The psychologist had been observing the interaction carefully, and she had noticed the specificity of both Lily's gestures and Bruno's response. This wasn't the general distress signal they had practiced in therapy. This was something different, something more targeted. Maria looked puzzled. "Those are signals she and Bruno practice at home," she explained. "They've developed their own way of talking to each other. When Lily can't find words, she uses her hands and Bruno understands. It's been part of our healing process, but I've never seen him react like that before. Usually he just comes closer or lies down beside her. This was different, more intense." Dr. Coleman's eyes widened as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. "You mean this isn't random behavior? The dog is actually responding to specific communications from Lily?" The psychologist had documented dozens of different signals that Lily and Bruno used to communicate, but she had never seen the particular combination of gestures that had just occurred in the courtroom. Before Maria could answer, Detective James Morrison, the lead investigator on the trafficking case, stepped forward. His weathered face showed the strain of months spent tracking down the members of Webb's criminal network. Morrison had seen enough cases to know when something significant was happening, and his instincts were screaming that Bruno had just given them the breakthrough they desperately needed. Morrison had been working trafficking cases for over 2 decades and had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize when pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. He had seen the devastating effects of these crimes on countless families and had made it his personal mission to bring down every network he encountered. The Webb case had consumed his life for the past 3 years, and he knew that this moment in the courtroom could be the key to finally achieving justice. "That dog recognized something," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked with canine units for 20 years, and I've never seen a therapy animal react with that kind of specificity unless there was a very good reason." Morrison had partnered with dozens of police dogs during his career, and he understood the subtle differences between various types of canine responses. What he had just witnessed was not general alertness or protective behavior. It was recognition. Dr. Coleman nodded slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. Children who have been trafficked often develop heightened awareness of their captors, she explained. They become extremely sensitive to danger signals. And if Bruno has been trained to respond to Lily's distress, then his reaction to Webb could be incredibly significant. The psychologist had studied the neurological effects of trauma on children and understood how the brain's threat detection systems could become hypervigilant after severe abuse. The implications were staggering. If Lily had recognized Webb as someone who had harmed her, and if Bruno had been trained to respond to her specific distress signals, then the dog's reaction could be considered a form of testimony. The legal precedent for such evidence was limited but not non-existent. There had been cases where animal behavior had been admitted as evidence, particularly in situations involving trained detection animals. Meanwhile, in the defense team's private conference room, Marcus Webb sat across from his attorney, Sandra Mitchell. The confident mask he had worn throughout the trial was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of the cold, calculating predator beneath his carefully constructed facade. He drummed his fingers nervously against the polished table as he replayed the moment when Bruno had reacted to Lily's signal. Webb had spent years perfecting his public persona, learning to project warmth and trustworthiness while hiding his true nature. He had studied the mannerisms of successful businessmen and philanthropists, copying their gestures, their speech patterns, and their social behaviors until the performance became second nature. But the sight of Lily in that courtroom had triggered memories he had tried to suppress. Memories of the power he had wielded over vulnerable children. "That damn dog," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with a venom that hadn't been present during his public appearances. The kid remembers more than we thought. Webb had convinced himself that the children he had abused were too traumatized to provide reliable testimony. He had counted on their silence, their fear, and their inability to articulate what had happened to them. But he hadn't considered that they might find other ways to communicate. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, her expression sharpening. "What are you talking about, Marcus? You said the child was too traumatized to provide reliable testimony." The attorney had built her entire defense strategy on the assumption that Lily's trauma would prevent her from giving coherent testimony. She had prepared to argue that any identification would be unreliable due to the child's psychological state. Webb's jaw tightened as he realized he had revealed more than he intended. "Nothing," he said quickly, trying to regain his composure. "But I'm concerned about how the jury might interpret the dog's behavior. It could be prejudicial to our case." Webb had spent his entire criminal career manipulating situations to his advantage, but he was beginning to realize that he might have underestimated the prosecution's ability to find alternative forms of evidence. But Mitchell was already studying her client with new suspicion. She had defended many criminals over the years, and she knew the difference between genuine innocence and carefully constructed lies. Webb's reaction to Bruno's behavior was telling her everything she needed to know about his true guilt. The attorney had built her reputation on her ability to read people, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that her client was hiding something significant. As the recess continued, Judge Hoffman called for an emergency conference in her chambers. She needed to understand the legal implications of what had occurred and whether Bruno's reaction could be considered admissible evidence. The prosecution and defense teams gathered around her desk while Dr. Coleman was brought in as an expert witness. The judge had presided over many unusual cases during her career, but she had never dealt with a situation quite like this one. The legal questions were complex and unprecedented. Could a therapy animal's behavior be considered a form of testimony? Was there sufficient scientific basis to support the reliability of such evidence? And how could the court ensure that the defendant's rights were protected while still allowing for innovative forms of evidence presentation? Judge Hoffman knew that her decision could set a precedent that would influence similar cases for years to come. "Your Honor," Chin began, his voice steady but urgent, "what we witnessed today was not a random occurrence. This child has developed a unique form of communication with her therapy animal, and the dog's reaction to the defendant was unmistakable. The prosecutor had spent the recess consulting with his team and reviewing legal precedents for similar situations. While the evidence was unusual, it was not without foundation." Mitchell immediately objected. This is nothing more than speculation, she argued. There's no scientific basis for claiming that a dog's behavior constitutes reliable testimony. This is a desperate attempt by the prosecution to introduce prejudicial evidence. The defense attorney knew that allowing such evidence could be devastating to her case, and she was prepared to fight it with every legal tool at her disposal. But Dr. Coleman shook her head firmly. Actually, there is substantial research supporting the reliability of trained therapy animals in recognizing trauma triggers, she explained. Bruno has been working with Lily for over a year. He's been specifically trained to respond to her distress signals and to provide protection when she feels threatened. His reaction today was not random. It was a trained response to Lily's communication that she recognized a source of danger. The psychologist had brought with her a thick folder of research papers and case studies documenting the use of therapy animals in trauma recovery. She explained how animals could be trained to recognize specific emotional states and respond appropriately, and how their reactions could provide valuable insights into their handler's psychological condition. The science was solid, even if the legal application was unprecedented. Judge Hoffman listened carefully to both arguments, weighing the unprecedented nature of the situation against the need to ensure that justice was served. She had never dealt with a case where a therapy animal's behavior could potentially serve as evidence, but she also understood that traditional rules might not apply when dealing with a child who had been so severely traumatized. The judge knew that her decision would be scrutinized by legal experts across the country. After 20 minutes of deliberation, she made her decision. The court will allow the prosecution to explore this line of evidence, she ruled, but I want Dr. Coleman present to provide expert interpretation of any interactions between the child and her therapy animal. The judge's ruling was careful and measured, designed to allow for the presentation of evidence while ensuring that proper safeguards were in place. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed dramatically. Word had spread about Bruno's reaction, and every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters and observers eager to witness this unprecedented moment in legal history. The case had already attracted national attention due to the scope of the trafficking operation, but now it was making headlines for an entirely different reason. Lily returned to the witness stand with Bruno by her side, her small hands once again gripping his leash tightly. The golden retriever seemed to sense the importance of the moment, his posture alert but calm, his eyes scanning the room with quiet intelligence. The bond between the child and her companion was evident to everyone watching, a connection that transcended species and spoke to the power of healing relationships. Chen approached carefully, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Lily," he said, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to help us understand what happened when you saw Mr. Webb. Can you show us again what you were trying to tell Bruno?" The prosecutor had spent years learning how to communicate with traumatized children, and he understood the importance of creating a safe space where they could express themselves without fear. For a long moment, Lily remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on her lap. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on her small shoulders as she struggled with memories that were too painful to fully process. Then slowly, she lifted her head and looked directly at Marcus Webb. Once again, her hands began to move in the same subtle pattern she had used before, a series of quick gestures that appeared meaningless to the untrained observer. Bruno's response was even more dramatic than before. The golden retriever shot to his feet, his hackles rising as a deep, threatening growl filled the courtroom. His body positioned itself between Lily and Webb, his protective instincts fully activated. The intensity of his reaction sent a collective gasp through the spectators, and several jury members leaned forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Dr. Coleman, who had been watching carefully, stepped forward to provide interpretation. "What you're witnessing," she explained to the jury, "is a trained communication system that Lily developed during her recovery. Bruno has been conditioned to recognize when she signals danger, and his reaction indicates that she perceives Mr. Webb as a direct threat." The psychologist's voice was calm and professional, but her words carried enormous weight. The impact on the jury was immediate. Several members leaned forward in their seats, their expressions showing a mixture of fascination and horror as they began to understand the implications of what they were seeing. This wasn't just a traumatized child struggling to testify. This was a survivor using every tool at her disposal to identify her captor. The power of the moment was undeniable. Mitchell rose quickly from her seat. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure theater. There's no way to verify what these signals actually mean or whether the dog's reaction has any basis in fact. The defense attorney was fighting desperately to prevent what she could see would be devastating testimony, but she could feel the momentum of the case shifting away from her client. But Judge Hoffman had been observing Webb during the exchange. She noticed how his composure had cracked, how his hands had begun to shake as Bruno's growls filled the room. The defendant's reaction was almost as telling as the dog's behavior. Overruled, she declared. The witness may continue. The judge's decision sent a clear message that the court was prepared to explore this unprecedented form of evidence. Chen pressed forward, building on the momentum. Lily, can you tell us anything about where you knew Mr. Webb from before today? The prosecutor was careful to phrase his questions in ways that would allow for nonverbal responses, understanding that pushing too hard could cause the child to retreat back into silence. The child's hands moved again, this time in a different pattern, and Bruno's response shifted as well. Instead of aggressive posturing, he moved closer to Lily, pressing his body against her legs in a gesture of comfort and protection. Dr. Coleman interpreted again. She's indicating a place of confinement, she explained, somewhere she felt trapped and afraid. The psychologist had worked with Lily long enough to understand the subtle differences in her communication patterns. The pieces began falling into place as Chen continued his questioning. Through Lily's unique communication system, a picture emerged of Webb's true nature. He hadn't been just a buyer in the trafficking network. He had been an active participant, someone who had visited the children being held captive, someone who had caused them direct harm. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom as the full scope of his involvement became clear. As the testimony continued, Webb's facade continued to crumble. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat beading on his forehead. His carefully styled hair began to look disheveled and his hands trembled visibly as he gripped the edge of the defense table. His attorney noticed the change and began whispering urgently in his ear, but it was clear that the carefully constructed defense was falling apart. The turning point came when Chen asked one final question. Lily, if Mr. Webb hurt you, can you show Bruno how you felt? The prosecutor knew that this question would be the most difficult for the child, but he also understood that it was necessary to establish the full extent of Webb's crimes. The child's response was heartbreaking. Her small body began to shake as her hands formed a series of rapid, desperate gestures that spoke of terror and pain. Bruno's reaction was immediate. He whined softly, pressing even closer to Lily while simultaneously keeping his eyes fixed on Webb in a display of protective vigilance that moved several jury members to tears. The raw emotion of the moment was overwhelming. That was when Webb finally broke. I can't, he shouted suddenly, rising from his seat, his voice cracking with emotion. I can't sit here and watch this anymore. The weight of his crimes and the undeniable evidence of Lily's silent testimony had shattered his carefully maintained facade, revealing the monster beneath. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Mitchell tried desperately to control her client, but Webb was beyond reason. The sight of Lily's pain, expressed through her gestures and Bruno's protective response, had triggered something in him. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, or perhaps simply the realization that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Your Honor, he said, his voice now barely above a whisper, I want to change my plea. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the packed courtroom. Reporters began frantically typing on their phones while spectators gasped and whispered among themselves. Judge Hoffman brought her gavel down hard, demanding order, but the damage was already done. Mr. Webb, she said sternly, are you stating that you wish to enter a guilty plea to all charges? The judge's voice carried the full weight of her authority as she sought to ensure that Webb understood the implications of his decision. Webb looked across the room at Lily, who was still sitting in the witness chair with Bruno pressed protectively against her side. The sight of the small girl and her faithful companion seemed to break something inside him. "Yes," he whispered. "I plead guilty to all charges." The confession sent another wave of gasps through the courtroom as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. The aftermath of Webb's confession revealed the full scope of his crimes. Not only had he been involved in the trafficking ring, but he had been one of its primary organizers, using his real estate connections to identify vulnerable families and his community standing to avoid suspicion. The investigation that followed his plea led to the arrest of 17 other individuals and the rescue of 12 more children who had been held in various locations throughout the state. Webb's real estate empire had been the perfect cover for his criminal activities. He had used his legitimate business dealings to scout locations for safe houses, his charitable work to identify vulnerable families, and his community connections to avoid scrutiny from law enforcement. The sophistication of the operation was staggering, involving corrupt officials, complicit business partners, and a network of facilitators who had helped move children across state lines. The rescued children ranged in age from 5 to 15, each carrying their own trauma and their own story of survival. Some had been held for months, others for years. All had been subjected to unimaginable abuse at the hands of Webb and his associates. The process of healing would be long and difficult, but the knowledge that their captor had finally been brought to justice provided a foundation for recovery. Lily's unique form of testimony had not only secured justice in her own case, but had opened the door to dismantling an entire criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. Legal experts hailed the case as a landmark moment that could change how courts handle testimony from traumatized children, while child welfare advocates point to it as proof that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who cannot speak. The case established important legal precedents regarding the use of alternative forms of testimony in cases involving severely traumatized witnesses. Courts across the country began developing new protocols for working with children who had been rendered unable to speak by their experiences, and therapy animal programs expanded their training to include communication assistance for trauma survivors. In the months that followed, Lily slowly began to recover her voice, working with Dr. Coleman and Bruno to rebuild her confidence and her ability to communicate through traditional means. The process was gradual and sometimes frustrating, but each small breakthrough was celebrated as a victory. The first time she spoke her mother's name brought tears to everyone who heard it. Her mother, Maria, became an advocate for other trafficking survivors, sharing their story to raise awareness about the signs of child exploitation and the importance of believing young victims even when they cannot express their trauma in conventional ways. Maria's transformation from a guilt-ridden mother to a powerful advocate inspired other families and helped create support networks for survivors. Bruno continued to serve as Lily's constant companion and protector, their bond serving as a testament to the healing power of unconditional love and trust. The Golden Retriever's intuitive understanding of his young handler's needs had not only helped solve a criminal case, but had provided a roadmap for other therapy animal programs working with severely traumatized children. Dr. Coleman published a groundbreaking paper on alternative communication methods for trauma survivors, citing Lily and Bruno's case as evidence that healing can take many forms and that sometimes the most profound truths are spoken without words. Her research influenced therapy protocols across the country, leading to new approaches that recognized the validity of nonverbal communication in both healing and legal contexts. Detective Morrison, who had spent years tracking the trafficking network, finally saw justice served for the children who had suffered under Webb's organization. He credited Lily's courage and Bruno's unwavering loyalty as the key factors that brought down one of the most sophisticated criminal operations he had ever encountered. The case became a defining moment in his career and reinforced his belief that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest circumstances. Judge Hoffman reflected on the case as one of the most challenging and rewarding moments of her judicial career. She had been forced to navigate uncharted legal territory, balancing the rights of the accused with a need to give voice to a child who had been silenced by trauma. Her decision to allow Bruno's reactions as evidence set a precedent that would influence similar cases for years to come. The community that had been shaken by the revelation of Webb's crimes slowly began to heal as well. The case had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about how predators can hide in plain sight, using their status and reputation to avoid detection. But it had also shown them the power of believing survivors and the importance of creating systems that protect the most vulnerable members of society. Marcus Webb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fall from respected community member to convicted felon served as a stark reminder that evil often wears a friendly face. The other members of his criminal network received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, their operations permanently dismantled thanks to the evidence uncovered after Webb's confession. For Lily, the end of the trial marked not just the conclusion of a legal proceeding, but the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Surrounded by people who believed in her, protected by a faithful companion who understood her without words, and supported by a community that had learned to listen even when the voice was silent, she began to rebuild her childhood one day at a time. The case of Lily Martinez and Bruno became a symbol of hope for survivors of trafficking and other forms of child abuse, showing that healing is possible even after the most severe trauma, and that justice can be achieved even when traditional methods fall short. Their story continues to inspire new approaches to both therapy and legal proceedings, ensuring that no child's voice goes unheard, regardless of how that voice chooses to speak. As years passed, Lily grew stronger. Her voice returned gradually, but she never forgot the lessons Bruno had taught her about communication, trust, and the power of silent understanding. She became an advocate in her own right, speaking at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement and child welfare workers, always accompanied by Bruno, who had become something of a celebrity in therapy animal circles. Their partnership had proven that sometimes the most profound connections transcend species and that healing can come from the most unexpected sources. In a world that often seems dark and dangerous, Lily and Bruno had shown that love, loyalty, and courage could triumph over even the most sophisticated evil, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. The ripple effects of their case continued to spread, creating new policies protecting child witnesses, implementing new training programs for therapy animals, and establishing new protocols for recognizing alternative forms of communication in legal settings. Their story had changed not just their own lives, but had helped create a system that was better equipped to protect and support other children who had suffered similar trauma. And in the end, that may have been the most important victory of all. Not just justice for Lily, but a transformation of the entire system that would make it easier for other silent voices to be heard and believed in the years to come. Because sometimes the most important words are the ones that are never spoken, and sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from the loyalty of a faithful friend who never stops believing in the child they are sworn to protect. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to hear about the power of courage and healing. Together, we can make sure that every child's voice is heard and that no survivor has to face their battle alone. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of justice, triumph, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and their animal companions. Because every story of survival deserves to be told, and every act of bravery deserves to be celebrated.